It's a real honor today to introduce our guest speaker, Maud Dahme. Maud grew up in the Netherlands and as a youngster had to go into hiding from the Nazis during World War II. And she's going to speak to us about her experience during that time. Maud grew up in the Netherlands during the war and was forced into hiding from the Germans as a 6-year-old girl, along with her 4-year-old sister, with a family they had never met. They spent from 1942 to 1945 in hiding during the occupation of her native country as hidden children. They were separated from their parents, who also had to go into hiding. Maud survived the experience and eventually emigrated to the US. She was a past president of the New Jersey State Board of Education for 24 years and also served as president of the National Association of State Boards of Education. She has been a member of the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education for 41 years and resides in Flemington, New Jersey. Please welcome Maud Dahme.
That's good. It's unusual for me to be stationary. Usually I have a mic and get all my steps in by walking. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share with you my story as a hidden child in the Netherlands during the Second World War. I'm going to read you something first because I never really talked about who I am and where I came from. And I arrived in the United States in 1950, but did not speak about it until 1981. I was watching 60 Minutes, and you've all seen 60 Minutes, and they had a beautiful story about Raoul Wallenberg, who rescued and saved many Jews. And usually with 60 Minutes, the following week, they show you on the screen letters or comments that people had made in the previous week's program. And I had watched the program, and the following week I was watching to see what people had written in on this. And this is what appeared. Now, this was in March 29th, 1981. And I quote, "The Jews of Europe were not exterminated in gas chambers. The gas chambers were wartime propaganda fantasies." And it was signed by someone I knew. And I was just so shocked by this. And I thought, yes, I have to start to speak my story. And that's what prompted me to start to speak. And the other thing that prevented me from speaking was, and I'll read you this too, because it's so interesting, because people didn't want to talk about it after the war. And this was written by Robert Krell. And I'll just read this. "Facing memory, silent no more. Years of life beyond almost certain death. Who would have thought that we would live to see this day given such overwhelming odds? For most of those years, child survivors have lived in silence. Silence served as well while hiding. Survival so often depended on not being noticed, being inconspicuous, on the ability to suppress tears and ignore pain. Grief was born in silence, and so was rage. Silence is the language of the child survivor. We might have talked after the war, but adults persuaded us to go on with life, forget the past. Adults who themselves had survived and suffered so much, inadvertently diminished the experiences of the children. In the aftermath, in that silence which enveloped our existence, what needed saying was not said." So I decided I was going to start this. Even my own parents, to the day they died, they never asked my sister and I what experiences we had had during those years. But I was born in a town called Amersfoort in the Netherlands. And I lived there with my mother and my father. And my mother had originally come from Germany. She had come to the Netherlands for a party, met this young man, fell in love, and they got married, and she became a Dutch citizen and lived in the Netherlands. And my father worked for his father. My grandfather had a restaurant at the train station, and my father learned to be a chef so worked for him. And my grandfather also, my Dutch grandfather also had kiosks, but not like a kiosk in the Netherlands. It's not like it is here. It was more like a newspaper stand at many, many of the train stations throughout the Netherlands. And we lived a very idyllic life. I have a sister, Rita, who's 2 years younger than I. But as you know, Hitler rose to power in Germany and things started to happen, especially after Kristallnacht. And my parents were very worried because my mother's parents still lived in Germany, in Frankfurt am Main, where my German grandfather was the cantor at the synagogue there. And they decided they really should come and live with us in the Netherlands. After all, the Netherlands had been neutral in the First World War, and the Netherlands was going to be neutral in the Second World War. So many people, Jewish people from Germany, left the country, and many came to the Netherlands also. So my parents thought they would be safe living with us in the Netherlands. So my dad went and got them, and they came to live with us, finding out that my grandfather had already been arrested a couple of times by the Nazis, but each time was able to leave. So they came to live with us. And life, as I said, was fine. And so many, as I said, so many German Jews also came to the Netherlands who had friends, relatives, but many didn't know anybody. So the Dutch government took a piece of land and built a whole bunch of barracks and even charged a Jewish committee for the cost of building those barracks. But people now had a home because they knew no one, and it became a whole community. It was called Westerbork, and there were many physicians, so they set up a little hospital. There were teachers because there were children, set up a school, and it became a whole little community on itself. As we were all watching what was happening in Germany, in May 10th in 1940, we woke up with airplanes in the middle of the night, airplanes overhead, and people were looking out the windows going, what is going on? Hitler invaded the Netherlands. And tanks started moving in. He invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. At first, it was kind of quiet. The Netherlands is a monarchy. Queen Wilhelmina left the country and set up a government in exile in England. And Hitler eventually chose someone by the name of Dr. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, an Austrian Nazi who was now the commandant of the Netherlands. And very quickly, things started to happen against the Jewish population of the Netherlands. All those people who were in Westerbork, they built fence around it, fenced them all. Oh, we have all these Jews right here, and closed it. And during the war, it became one of the biggest transit camps. So my parents also, what is going on? The first thing we all had to do, if you were Jewish, you had to register. So people registered. Who would have dreamt what that would be used for? Everyone registered. And all of a sudden, more and more regulations started to come out against the Jewish population. My parents in the restaurant and at the kiosks, they had to hire someone, a Nazi, just to oversee that everything was okay. My mother couldn't even go to, well, we didn't have supermarkets, but go to the meat market or the grocery store. These are the days Jewish housewives may go, and these are the hours. So all of a sudden we were being restricted, even though we were Dutch citizens like everyone else. And life became more and more difficult. I was so excited because in the summer of 1941, I was going to start school, public school. I was going to kindergarten. I was so happy, and I loved going to school. And my teacher, Mrs. Eva Schnell, she had also escaped from Germany and was now my teacher. But more and more things started to happen, more and more restrictions. They took away our cars. Jews can't have cars. All of a sudden, signs appeared. Parks, forbidden for Jews. In restaurants, Jews not wanted. We were not allowed to go on public transportation. So you can imagine what it was like. Everything that we enjoyed like everyone else, just because we were Jewish, was taken away from us. And life became more and more difficult for all of us. Then of course, now they all knew who was Jewish, who wasn't Jewish. If you were Jewish, They fired everyone working in any form of government, whether the township, the town, federal government, you were fired. They also decided that Jewish children shouldn't go to public school. They should go to Jewish schools. We didn't even have that in my community. So the mothers got together because they also, by the way, fired all the teachers who were Jewish, or principals, superintendents, anyone involved in a public school system who was Jewish was automatically fired. So some of the mothers and teachers got together and rented some rooms and tried to continue our education as best as they could. Then another regulation came out, and it said anyone who is 6 years old and older has to wear the yellow star. I'm sure you all have seen this. And inside our star, it said J-O-O-D, which in Dutch it's pronounced Jood, which means Jew. Well, I had just turned 6. I was so excited because I could wear a star just like all the big people. And of course, my mother really didn't want to put, and my sister didn't have to wear one because she was only 4. So, but I was so excited, so proud. My mother had to buy a big sheet or piece of material with all the stars stamped on, cut them out and sew them on our jacket. So every time we went out, we had to have this star. So you were easily identified. And I remember even walking in our town, people were coming towards us. We had to get off the sidewalk, let people pass. I remember that. But I was just so proud of the star that I had. My mother told me afterwards that many of the parents in the neighborhood, they said to their children, I don't want our kids to play with them. So it became very difficult. And of course, didn't, at the age of 6, I couldn't fully understand. But my sister wanted one too. So she did the usual thing called temper tantrums and I don't know what else. And my mother sewed one on her jacket too. And I even remember my Dutch grandmother was in the hospital. She had had a heart attack, and because we had no car, no transportation, I remember we had to walk to the hospital. I remember walking through the park, even though there was a sign there that said, you were not allowed, as Jews, we're not allowed to go through the park. I remember my mother saying, gee, it's kind of warm out today. Let's take off our jackets. So, but it was very difficult for everyone. And more things started to happen. And my parents were really concerned about everything that was going on. So one Sunday afternoon, there was one synagogue in my town. The rabbi called the whole congregation together. And he read a letter, and the letter was from the German command saying, now, of course, by this time, war had already started. And he said, the letter said was wonderful news for the Jews of Amersfoort. We're going to take you away from the war scene because war had started, bombing, everything was going on. And my hometown is in the middle of the country. It had been occupied before the war with the Dutch army. It was now occupied by German soldiers. So we were a huge target. And the letter said, we're going to take you away from the war scene. We're going to have trains. We'll let you know when to be at the train station. We're going to have trains and then we'll be going east. And I thought it'll be wonderful because you will be away from the war scene and the fathers and mothers can get jobs and the children can continue their education. Here's a list of items you should bring with you, like one suitcase, clearly mark it with your name on the outside, and bring some work clothes, and also bring a pillow, some blankets, also some things for the train, like a plate, a mug, some utensils. So everybody left the synagogue and say, what does that mean? What's going on? So my parents snuck into the house of a friend of theirs, a Christian friends, because we were not allowed to see our Christian friends in our home and we were not allowed to go to their home. So they snuck into his house. And I think he was like the deputy mayor, and they thought maybe he would know. So my parents walked in. And my mother looked on his desk and she saw that same letter that had just been read in the synagogue. And so she thought, oh, he may be a Dutch Nazi, and there were many. or he's working for the resistance. So his name was Case. She finally got up enough nerve and she said, Case, how come you have this letter? And he said, well, I'll tell you. We have been going all over the Netherlands asking Christian families, would they be willing to take in Jewish children? The children are our first priority. I have an address for your children. I can't tell you who they are. I can't tell you where they live. I think the only thing he said was they lived on a farm. He said, think about it, and we have to know by tomorrow morning. So my parents went home, and, I look at it now, being a parent myself, what a very difficult decision to have to make. I'm 6.5, Rita is 4.5, to send us away to total strangers. No, may never ever see your children again. But my parents said, yes. So I remember that afternoon, my mother sat me down and she said, I have such great news for you. You and your sister are going on a vacation to a farm. And living in the city, we are so excited. And she said, and while you're on your vacation, we'll go on our vacation. And maybe in 2 weeks, we'll come back and pick you up at the farm. So we were so excited about going to a farm for a couple of weeks. So my father was told where to bring us. Now, I don't remember that, but I do remember that the following morning, my mother had packed a little suitcase for us with clothes for the next 2 weeks. And I remember riding our bicycles or tricycles, and with my father, he had the little suitcases, and he walked us to a house in the neighborhood, though I don't remember what I was told. And of course, unfortunately, there's no one alive to ask anymore. But I remember we got to a house in the neighborhood, and at the garden gate, my father gave me the little suitcases, and he took the bicycles, and he said, Maud, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a wonderful time. Take very good care of your little sister. Went in the house, and it was a lovely family. I didn't know them, and they had children also, and we had dinner with them, and they put us to bed. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, they woke us up, and they said, hurry up, you have to get dressed. So being good little girls, we got dressed, and this is what had to happen. This gentleman's name was Jan Canis, who, by the way, I have recognized all my rescuers and people who worked for the resistance directly with us at Yad Vashem as the righteous among nations. But so his name was Jan Canis. And so what had to happen was we got dressed and we had to go on a train to the farm, which was in another part of the Netherlands. But they didn't want us to be seen at the train station because having the two businesses there and everybody around there knew my sister and I. So we had to walk through the woods in the middle of the night to the next town. And I remember that because I'm a big girl now, because I had my own flashlight and I got rather involved in picking blueberries, wild blueberries. And he kept saying, come on, keep going. And by daylight, we did arrive at the next town and took a train. And we did arrive on the farm. I don't remember how we got from the train station to the farm, but we arrived at this farm, and it was an area of the Netherlands where they were deeply religious farmers, very poor, but deeply religious. And I remember arriving on the farm, and it was like bedlam because all the farms were along the major highway with all the fields in the back. And the major highway was one lane this way, one lane that way. And it was nothing but German military vehicles and tanks and going back and forth. Soldiers walking all over the farm, soldiers having set up big guns because they were shooting at the Allied planes that were coming over on their bombing runs. So I guess they didn't know what to do with these two little girls because they spoke a dialect there and they were dressed in the traditional Dutch costumes, wooden shoes and all. And here were these two little city girls in their little city dresses. So I guess they may have told me, and I don't remember, that we're going to be playing hide and go seek. So they took us in back of the farm, and the wheat had not been cut. This is in August. So they told me that we had to go, I guess told me to hide, take my sister and hide in the wheat field and playing hide and go seek. I don't remember, but and they said, and just don't walk in straight because you leave a trail, just zigzag in, take your sister by the hand. And here is an umbrella because it looks like it's going to rain. So I took the umbrella and took my sister by the hand, and we zigzagged into this field. I guess they told us to stay there. But what happened was my sister started to cry. She wanted her mommy. And then it started to rain. I'm such a bright child, even at 6.5. I opened the umbrella. You could now see an umbrella for about 20 miles in the middle of a wheat field and a child crying for mommy. So I guess they decided this was not a good idea. So they took us and put us in the house. And that evening, a couple of relatives came over, I guess, wanted to meet us. But I felt like I was the grown-up because I was telling them that I am such a big girl now because I wear a star. I'm not wearing my star. Oh, and I don't know, I remember that. Oh, and I said that I go to school. And then nothing else, the people left. I don't remember what else I answered or what they asked. And after they left, that very first evening, this couple who were in their 60s, had no children, and they decided they were going to tell me, they sat me down at 6.5 and said, we're going to tell you something that you must remember, no matter what. And they said, you are supposed to be our nieces who have been bombed out of a city, which was happening all over the Netherlands. So many people were homeless because of all the bombing. And since you are our nieces, you have to call us aunt and uncle. In Dutch, uncle is oom, aunt is tante, but my sister couldn't say tante, she called her Tannie. So all our lives, she was always Tannie to us. So you can't go to school here because we're afraid you might say something to a classmate and they may go home and tell whatever you said to their parents, and they may be Dutch Nazis. You can't go to school. And also, you're going to have, since you're our nieces, our last name, which was Sprunk. And your first name, in English it's pronounced Maud, in Dutch it's pronounced Maud. I now became Margje or Margie Sprunk, and my sister Rika Sprunk. You cannot go outside anywhere until you must remember this, no matter. And they had to work, they were poor, they had to work the farm all day. So we were left in the house. Don't go near the windows, don't answer the door. And after a while, I guess I now know my new name, who I am. And we were able to go outside with them to work the fields. But it was, I understood a lot because they said, if I don't remember this correctly, soldiers were going to take us away. So, you know, not fully understanding, but this fear that I had if I messed up. So one day we had spent a day at another farm, and we came back and I knew that something had happened on the farm. So I was being very inquisitive, I guess, and Uncle took me outside. He looked around. There were no soldiers around. At dusk, we went to one of the barns, and that barn had like an extra roof extended where we kept all the firewood because there was no gas, electric, there was no running water either on the farm. So he looked around, and you could look right into the next farm. No one is around. He cleared away some of the wood, and there was a trap door. He opened the trap door, and I looked in, and there was a young Jewish boy with about 17 hiding there. I didn't know who he was, and he introduced me, and then we left again, went back in the house, and Uncle said to me, you have to bring him something to eat once a day, but be very, very careful that nobody sees you. And everything went really well until one day I had brought him something to eat. Now, you imagine the trap door is open, And I had gone down and he had eaten, and I came back up and I looked, and there were half a dozen German soldiers standing there just staring at me. I didn't know what to do, but I must have been maybe around 7.5. I decided I was going to pretend they weren't there. So I busied myself, put the pot down, put the trapdoor down, covered it neatly with wood, picked up the pot, and I had to turn my back to walk out. And I prayed because I was sure I was going to be shot on the spot. Nothing happened. Soldiers looked, they turned around and left. Of course, when I came in the house, I was hysterical, and they said, you know, they're going to tell, they didn't do anything. They're going to tell a superior officer, and they're going to come back and get all of us. And I prayed every night. I was so scared because I knew if the soldiers would come back, it would be my fault. But no one ever came back. And I realized, you know, many years later, as I became an adult, what happened? These were soldiers, fathers who had been drafted into the army. They weren't the Nazis, and they just never told anyone of what they had seen and saved our lives. But it became so difficult, especially not fully understanding, but having this constant fear. And one evening we had been out, and another relative came back, and uncle was taking off his jacket. He went like this and he fell down at my feet. He died and had a heart attack. And so the resistance, well, it was January, this was now, we went into hiding in the summer, August of 1942. Uncle died January 20th, 1944. And he was buried on my birthday, January 24th. I will always remember. But then the resistance came to Anne and said, look, you can't run the farm anymore. We'll have to find another address for the two little girls. And she said, no, I'm keeping them. And if their parents return, I will return them to their parents. If not, I'm going to raise them as my own. So we stayed, and a nephew came with his family to run the farm, and we were allowed to live in one room, and we stayed with her. Then, as you know, there was the landing in June of 1944 in France, and now it was December 1944. And we were in the room with Anne, and two strangers came in and they said, you have to leave right now. And they just took my sister and I and put us on the back of their bicycles. Because there were many people who were working with the Nazis. They were getting paid if they could tell them, oh, I know there's some Jews hidden over there. So, but there were many Dutch who were working with the resistance. But evidently they had overheard that there was going to be a roundup at the farm. They were going to come. They knew who we were. They were going to come and get us. So they were able to very quickly get us out of there. And we ended up, I still remember, in another farmhouse for the night. And I remember I'm still looking for that house, rhododendrons in front. But we spent the night there, and then we were taken to another family in a little fishing village. Very medieval little village with a moat all around and cobblestone streets. And there was a family there who took us in, and they had a daughter who was about 18 at the time. And it was so very difficult there because the winter of 1944 to 45 was the hunger winter in the Netherlands. There was nothing to eat. People started eating tulip bulbs. They said, don't eat them. They're toxic. You're going to die. Well, nobody died. So they had all these mushy recipes with all the bulbs they could find. But the saving grace actually in the village was that there were fishermen. And many, many years before the war, there was a huge inlet from the North Sea. And the Dutch had built a dam across on top between two provinces, closed it off, and it became a lake, and the water started changing from salt water to fresh water with all the rivers emptying into it. And most of the fish died, except one fish just continued to multiply. And, you know, especially when I talk to elementary school children, I ask them, what do you think that fish was? Well, they come up with everything that doesn't exist there at all. And finally, one little girl 1 year, she said, I know. I said, what is it? She said, eel. I said, you're right. How did you know that? She said, I read it in Little House on the Prairie. And that was, and another time a little boy raised his hand and he said, I know, I know. And he also said, eel. I said, how did you know? He said, I've heard you speak before. But it was that was our saving grace. And it was so difficult in the village because there was nothing to eat. Now, we blended in very well by now. We were dressed like everyone else. We spoke the dialect. So, and there again, I had a new name. There, my first name was Marie. My last name was Hogendorn. But life in the village was very, very difficult. You had to be very, very careful. And of course, when I told the story about that young man and these German soldiers, after they moved him immediately out of the farm in that hole in the barn, and he ended up in the same village we were. I found out after the war because he survived, but I never saw him again. But he did survive. But it was very, very difficult and very scary, I think, for all of us. And of course, there was no contact with my parents at all. My parents didn't know if we were alive or not. And you'll see something that I will read afterwards. But it was like nobody knew what, even when I started school, the nurse would say, with my mother, what childhood diseases have your daughter had? And my mother would say, Maud, what did you have? And the nurse would look at my mother like, what kind of a mother is that? Not realizing, you know, of what we had gone through. But living, and then one day too, I distinctly remember there were so many times that, you know, it was so close to being discovered and having to be so careful. One day, the family we stayed with wanted us to go to a farm in the next village and beg for food. And even when we were still on the farm, people were coming from the cities. They were called trekkers, to beg for food because there was nothing. And so they said, wanted us to go to the farm, see if we get a couple of eggs. And I remember we're walking along this lake and it had a dike around it. And we were walking there, two little girls, and all of a sudden airplanes started coming overhead. The Allied planes were bombing where we were going, the next village or the next town. And the little German fighter planes came up and all this was happening overhead. So I remember grabbing my sister and laying at the side of the dike just so that we wouldn't stand out, because the German little fighter planes had great sports in just shooting people off their bicycles or people walking. So that there was so much. And it was a time too, birthdays were never celebrated. There were no toys, but I had a lot of toys. I went around and picked up all sorts of spent ammunition. It was all over, you know, planes crashing and coming down, stuff falling out of the sky. So I collected all this stuff and I had this secret shelf in one of the barns. Nobody knew. And then when we were with the other family, we were with them for 4 months. And I'll have to tell you what I found after I came back. But it got more and more difficult. And then they said, well, they had already freed the lower part of the Netherlands, but where all the rivers run across from Germany and Switzerland into the North Sea, there was a great deal of resistance by the German army there. And we were north. So the South was free. We were not free. And then one day, it's now April 1945, they said they've broken through. And I remember it was April 18th, that day, they said, they have just freed the village before us, and they're coming to free our village. German soldiers left the village, and everybody came out because we were already with flags and anything orange, because the royal family was the House of Orange. We're celebrating. German soldiers came back, and we're very angry to see what was happening. And I remember there was nothing but shooting, and it was awful. And then they left again. So people quietly went out and retrieved their wounded and their dead, brought them into the house. and nobody went outside. And we waited, and we were on the second floor in this house, and I could look out a window where they told me the tanks were going to come in. And I sat there and looked, and all of a sudden, I saw a truck come in with men in blue coveralls. I found out years later, these were Dutch resistance fighters who were given the honor of coming in first because they knew the village was safe. But right behind that came the tanks with the Canadian soldiers. Most of the Netherlands was freed by Canadians. And it was like crazy. Everybody's out. And I still get very emotional for that day because that was the day was our freedom. And I remember everybody came out and were climbing all over these huge tanks, and the soldiers were throwing out their rations because they know we were starving. And something else they threw out, and I was standing next to the daughter of that family, and she had something in her hand. I didn't know what it was, and she wanted to give it to me. And I don't want that. So she unwrapped it. And I don't know what this brown thing was. So she broke off a piece and shoved it in my mouth. It was chocolate. And I wrote a book, and the title of my book is Chocolate, the Taste of Freedom. So we were freed. And they decided, well, we should go back to the farm with Aunt and wait to see if my parents survived. So we went back on the farm with Aunt, and the first thing I did was I ran into that barn for my secret shelf of ammunition that I had. Well, it was mostly live ammunition. I had a couple of hand grenades, and it was destroyed, of course. I never saw it again. But so they said, well, the parents had survived. And I remember we were standing in the pump room with Aunt. There was a door to the outside, a door. We were standing on the inside. We were kind of hiding behind her skirts. And there was a man and a woman standing in the doorway. And Tani gave me a shove, and she said, that's your mommy and your daddy. Shake their hand. So I went up, shook hands. I ran back. I didn't know these people. So that's when I took my father to the barn after a couple of days to show him my toys. Well, of course, the poor man almost had a heart attack, never saw any of that again. But so they stayed for a while. I don't know how long they stayed. So I didn't remember them. So now I'm 9.5 years old. And I said, okay, we'll go home with you. But if we don't like you, we're coming back and staying with Aunt. I guess I was rather fresh thing even then. And so we went back with my parents. And it was very, very difficult. Our house was gone, bombed. We moved into my Dutch grandparents' home. And but let me just backtrack of how my parents survived. The day my sister and I had gone into hiding, that evening, Dutch friends of my parents snuck in the house to see my parents, and they came in and they said, well, where are the children? Where are the girls? So my parents explained that we had gone into hiding that day. And they said, well, where are you going to go? Because they know they were picking people up. And they said, we have no place to go. And they said, come and stay with us. They had like a car dealership with it was in town. It was a self-standing building, and it had the showroom in the front, the service area in the back, and they lived in the apartment above it. They said the only problem is that there's 2 German officers living in one of the bedrooms. So my parents said, yes, we'll come and stay with you. They packed a few things, left everything in the house, and walked to their place. So my parents lived in their attic for 3 years. My father could never go outside because evidently he would be recognized, his hometown. And he was of an age, they were just grabbing young men right off the street to send them to Germany for the factories. So my mother went out dressed as a nurse, and she said she would overhear things because German was her native tongue. overhear things. And she said, then she went out to try and get food for them because they had nothing to eat. So, but they survived. My mother did tell me one they were there and there was a bombing or something. And she said there were German soldiers everywhere. And for some reason, they never even noticed my parents, who were all with everybody was trying to find a place to get away from the bombardment. But they survived. So now we were all back home and we had nothing but the clothes on our back. We moved into my Dutch grandparents' home. There was nothing. During the war, the Germans hired a moving company called Pulse. It eventually became a verb. If your house was pulsed, meaning that they came, took everything, since nobody was in the house, took everything out, put it on the truck and shipped it to Germany. And since so many homes were abandoned, people came in and took wood because they needed firewood, the floors, the doors, whatever. So there was nothing in this house, and just boarded up with a little piece of glass, actually airplane glass, to had a little light. And it was very, very difficult. The adjustment was very, very hard to, once again, for my sister and I, to live with people we really didn't know. My mother, and then we found out about all what happened with, some people who survived the concentration camps, what happened and where was the rest of our family. So my mother, I remember, received a letter from the Dutch Red Cross informing her that her parents, my Dutch grandfather, and my mother was an only child, but my father had a sister, she was married, and I had 3 little cousins. They all perished in a camp called Sobibor in Poland. It was a camp where you did not live out the day unless you had a special trade that would be useful. My Dutch grandmother, if you remember, I said she had been in the hospital. So when my Dutch grandfather was called to come to the train station to go on the train, because the train was first going to Amsterdam, everybody collected there. So my grandfather asked if he could have an ambulance, because his wife couldn't go on the train, if he could have an ambulance to bring her and him to Amsterdam by ambulance, which they granted. And my Dutch grandmother died in Amsterdam. And she's actually, friends of mine in the Netherlands actually found her grave. She is buried in a Jewish cemetery in the Netherlands. And of course, the rest of the family, all our second, third cousins and aunts and uncles, everyone perished. I don't know if anybody has any questions at this point. Yes, sir. I would just like to continue a little bit more about coming to the United States, because that was a whole other drama. Friends, some of my mother's relatives from Germany had gone to the United States in the late 30s, and they found out we had survived. And they asked if they would sponsor us to come to the United States. My dad said no. And then after a while, there were just so many memories. No matter where you went, there were things that reminded us all of what had happened. He said yes. So arrived in the United States in April seems to be the month for me, I think. April 24th, 1950. We arrived in the United States. Actually, put my first foot on the ground in Hoboken, New Jersey, because it was the Holland America line. And then again, trying to now adjust and not being able to speak the language. And so it was a very difficult transition once again. But I'm now 14 and a half years old, but somehow we survived. But there's so much more, but time doesn't permit. But I just want to say there were 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands. 107,000 were deported. 5,200 survived the camps. 24,000 Jews went into hiding, and 16,000 were not discovered. And I am so ever so grateful and of people who risked their lives to save us. I married. I have 4 children. I have 9 grandchildren, 1 great-granddaughter and a great-grandson on the way. Hitler did not succeed with our family tree. Many branches were broken, but it's all broke up. It's all coming up again with new branches and new flowers. He did not succeed. Our family tree is beautiful and continues to grow. Thank you.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating, exciting, and terrifying story. I'm sure there's lots of questions. Please make sure the questions are brief and use the remote mic over here on the side, and she will stay up here where she can also be seen on Zoom to answer your questions. Thank you.
Just two quick, you didn't mention what, you said your sister survived, but you haven't mentioned, you know, where she is. And the other, how old are you when you realized, when you understood why you were being targeted?
I don't think I ever fully understood during that time. I was too little. I understood it more as I got older and learned more. And my sister she does not remember anything. I mean, there were many things that I experienced during the war that no child should see, or things that happened to us during those years. Because remember, we weren't totally supervised. So that was, you know, a lot of things happened, but my sister is fine and well. She married too, has children and grandchildren, and lives in Charleston, South Carolina.
Hi, I'm Emerson Schroeder, and I'm doing a school project, so I came to hear your story. And I was wondering, how does Holocaust denial affect you? And what is some advice you would give to like navigating it, because it's like growing?
It does affect me, because especially right now, there's so much anti-Semitism going on. And even with the people, as I said in the beginning, who claim this never happened. And that's why I think it's so important for the survivors like myself to speak about our experiences, especially in schools, to the younger generation, so they could meet someone who actually survived this and went through it. So I think that's, it affects me. I've run into it. My name is all over the internet with whatever, every breath I take, I think it's reported, so that I check to see what's there. And sometimes I do find some stuff on there. I don't know how to combat that, but it's so important, I think, especially to students like you, to hear survivors and learn what happened and know the truth rather than believe things that people are saying, which is not true. So what school do you go to? I haven't been there. Maybe I should come and speak to yours.
I'm doing a project. Oh, I'm doing a project mostly focusing on Holocaust denial. So, yeah.
Well, it was interesting. That little blurb that was on 60 Minutes was signed by someone I knew.
Whoa.
And that was even more shocking. And I didn't know who she was. I found out years later she was a German war bride. And then and it was interesting because I was very much involved in my town in the political arena too. And I was supporting a man running for mayor. And this woman and her husband were working for this guy. When I saw that, I went public and said, I cannot support someone who has people like that working for him on his campaign. I'm going to support the opposite person, and the other person won.
What is the name of your book so I can write it down and maybe read?
Well, the book is not available on Amazon or bookstores. I wrote it with Stockton University, and they have their publisher. And there's a book here, and on the back it will
right.
tell you, but maybe you can put it on your,
On our book club.
sure.
Excuse me, my name is Elliot Braun. Remarkable story. Pardon me if you had said this earlier, but What kind of relationship did you end up having with your parents in terms of communication? Were they able to talk to you at all about what had happened to them?
My mother only told me a little bit, but they never asked us till the day they died. They never knew what experiences we had, good or bad. And that was just the norm, not to, life has to go on. We're not going to dwell on it. And that was one of the reasons I never talked about it either. I had been in this country 30 years before I started to speak as to who I am. And it was because of what I saw on 60 Minutes and also read in the paper. Then Governor Kane was creating it was an advisory council on Holocaust education. And I had worked on his campaign. So I called the governor's office. I said, I want to be on that. And they said, Maud, why would you want to be on that? And I told them my story. And I've been on this now, 41 years. So it's so important. So now then I started speaking about it because I think it's important. And as I said to this young lady too, it's so important, especially to our youth. Now, I do a great deal of speaking in schools also. And the last couple of years with all the Zooms, I think they said she knows how to do it. So get her, she'll do it. But the one thing I didn't like Zooms that much, but the one thing I did like was I was able to ask the teachers to ask the parents to also sit and listen to my story, because then I knew that the dinner discussion would be very different. So that was because it's very hard to be able to get parents to come to the schools to listen to someone speak, unless it's in the evening or something like that.
Thanks for telling your story. It resonated with me. My father was a Holocaust survivor and never, he lived till he was 92, but never said a word about it. Absolutely refused to tell the story. So thanks for speaking up.
My PBS, NJN or PBS did a documentary. I take teachers every year to the Holocaust sites through the commission. And they decided one year they were going to film the part in the Netherlands, because that's our last stop. And my mother was so angry with me that she said, why are you doing this? Why are you talking about this? Because it's going to happen again. Maybe not in your lifetime, but you're putting your children at risk. But I defied her and I said, yes, Mom, I'm still talking.
Well, is there online?
Yes, I want to thank you for the riveting story and the firsthand account by somebody that lived through it in the Netherlands. I have a question. A while back, I saw this Dutch movie. In its original language was called Zwartboek. I don't know if you've heard of it. It was about something similar. It was about a woman in hiding. She hid her passport, which gave her true identity, in the house that she was living, and she had to adopt, a Catholic, understand how Catholicism worked and everything, and blend into the family. And one day, errant bomb hit the house, and she knew she would be discovered. So she had a very difficult choice, and she decided to go into the underground, into the resistance movement. And the movie sort of progressed from there, but it was a very, very interesting movie. I don't know if you ever saw that.
Well, there's quite a few movies that I've searched and found about the Netherlands, and also some that were produced in the Netherlands. And yes, it's just amazing how many people just stood up and helped. They were all upstanders, not bystanders. The book also has many, many pictures. A lot of people, friends of my parents, and had pictures of our youth. And it was also very common to bury things before you went into hiding, buried in the yard, your silverware, your valuables, bury it in the ground. And so My book has a lot of pictures on it too, and my book is really addressed to young adults. It's nothing graphic in the book. I wanted to tell my story, but how people cared and to save us and risk their own lives and how important that is.
I'm Mark Edelman. It's hard to formulate a question about this. What strikes me so much is the trust and inclusion that you experienced from the people who took care of you. And that to me seems almost miraculous. When I look around me here today, I don't see a whole lot of it. I'm not sure what you can say about it. You've said you've maintained some contact with those people who took care of you. How do you express your gratitude? How do you recognize them and include them?
Well, I do. That's why I said I have them all recognized at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. And I am, even though all my rescuers are gone, they have passed on, yet there were many nephews and nieces and the whole family. I'm in the Netherlands every year. We always all meet up. And I feel that I honor them so much and my gratitude by speaking about the wonderful things that these people risked their lives to save us. It didn't matter they were Christians, we were Jews, we're human beings to save us. So I feel by my speaking so much, I honor them constantly and forever grateful.
Mike Katz?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. It's just an incredible story like so many of these are. I am wondering if you might have come across a friend of mine who is now deceased by the name of Bob Max. And Bob was drafted into the U.S. Army. He was Jewish and eventually fought in the Battle of the Bulge and was taken prisoner by the Germans and was in a slave labor camp for several months. And as VE Day approached, he escaped and eventually wound up back home, spent a year in an Army hospital recovering from his wounds. And he also never spoke about any of these experiences to his family or to anyone else for many years. And then there was an event that occurred, I don't recall exactly what it was, that inspired him to tell his story. And like you, he went around to many schools, colleges, other groups telling his story, and he also wrote a book about those experiences. And I was wondering if you had ever run across Bob.
No, I did not. It's very hard because there are so many survivors. It's getting less and less, but we're never on the same program at the same time. So that, you know, I know about many of the survivors and sometimes we do our program together, but no, I never met this gentleman. And that was so interesting too, even in, but why don't we show some of the more questions? I could go on. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Danny Barr. I'm a guest today and I'm from Belgium. So I want to say first, thank you, El, for telling your story. And my parents are also were able to escape from Belgium for the same reason. I just wanted to know, similar to the question by the gentleman before, what do you think was the motivation for these people, this tante and the family to do an home to took a lot of risk to hide you? Do you think what was behind their motivation for doing so?
I think their deep faith. As I said, they were very religious. We went to church every Sunday, and that's what within. And it was their deep faith. And I think more than anything, that's the reason they did what they did. They weren't getting paid for this. And they risked their lives. because if we were found, they would be murdered too. So I think it was their deep faith, and it's still there whenever I meet up with all of them. So I think that's why they did it more than anything. This just shows you a map of the different of what mostly Western Europe. Okay, and then as I mentioned, the number of Jews who lived in the Netherlands is listed there. Go ahead. This is a picture of me before the war. Okay. This was a family picture that was taken about, I think, a year and a half before we went into hiding. I'm the one with the very nice hairdo. Okay. This was a composite picture. To the top left are my Dutch grandparents, to the right, my German grandparents, below my father's sister, her husband, and my three cousins who all perished. Okay. This is a very old picture of the train station, the building all the way to the left where you see that roof. That was the restaurant. Go ahead. This, of course, is a picture I took because you can tell by the cars. And this was the restaurant in the background there. Okay. This was a picture taken, and you can show the next one also. This is a picture taken of when we couldn't go to school anymore. And this was the Jewish classroom that the teachers and the parents put together. Okay. This is the material that my mother had to buy with all the stars on it. This is a picture you can see all of the little kids having to wear the star. Okay. Again, a picture of Europe. This was the dark part there was the Jewish quarter in Amsterdam. Okay. As you can see, it says in English, the Jewish quarter, and says it in German and in Dutch, and you can see, go ahead. The next picture, again, you can see how everything is boarded up. This was in Amsterdam, the Jewish quarter. Okay. This was one of the transit camps. Okay. They took down all the Dutch names of streets, the Germans did, because they wanted to all be German. So these are some of the street names that they had taken down and replaced with their own. Okay. This is a picture of mothers and children waiting to board the trains to go to the concentration camps. Picture of Anne Frank. Okay. And Anne Frank again writing her diary. Okay. This is a picture of my sister and I that was taken during the war, and even put us back in our little city dresses that Aunt took, which was very nervy to take us to a photographer to do this. Okay. The next picture, that's Tani or Aunt in the picture with us. Okay. This is a picture of Uncle. This is a picture of Aunt's brother, the wooden shoemaker who also lived there. That was a hearing aid in the 1940s. Okay. This was found in a magazine. Again, the next. My sister and I happened to see it in a book. This was the picture of the way the farmhouse looks today. Okay. This is the farmhouse on the right. On the left was the barn where the young man was hidden. Okay. This was a note that I remember somebody gave me a piece of paper and pencil and gave me a pot of ink and a pen, and I traced letters. I didn't know what it said. But it said, "Dear Mommy and Daddy, we like it here very much. We want to be free. We'd very much like to see you again. I'm helping Aunt milk the cows, and I want to become a farmer's girl. The teacher is giving us lessons, and I can already read. I'm sleeping by one of the neighbors because Uncle had died." Then it says, "Goodbye, so long, Margie and Rika Sprunk." And that was written right after Uncle died and it must have been my parents probably, my mother gave it to me long after the war, she had it. Then my parents knew at that time, which was the spring of 1944, that we were still alive. Okay. These were huts that one of the villages built and made in the woods where they were hiding Jews, and also flyers who were shot down, Allied flyers would transit through there. Okay. This is the house in the little fishing village. Okay. And it was on the second floor. That's where I saw the bottom picture. I saw where the tanks came in that day. This is one of the last of my rescuers who is still alive, the daughter of the second family. This was the house. It's already boarded up. It's been long gone, where my parents were hidden. Okay. And that is the back of that house. And my parents hid in that attic for 3 years. This was one of the transit camps. It's a picture of my sister and I after the war studying. This is a picture of me now and then. I worked for Pan American World Airways. That's me on the right. That's Henry Fonda signing his book. Or not his book, he did the films. Okay. And this is a picture of my husband and I. He eventually became a pilot for Mohawk Airlines and then US Airways. That's it. No, I still can't leave.
Thank you. Make use of the mic here. Thank you very much, Maud, for a very compelling presentation this morning, and which we appreciate very much. And we have 3 ways of thanking you. The first is with an orchid. When the Old Guard was formed in 1930, the Old Guard Summit was the capital, orchid capital for the country. So the Old Guard took on the orchid as its logo, and in honor, of course, of the organization in the city of Summit. So we give you an orchid to take home. Excuse me. And we also have a certificate here from the Old Guard, certificate of appreciation with your name on it, signed by our director. And the third way of thanking you is with the Old Guard salute. Which is standing ovation. Thank you very much, Maud.
Thank you so much for all these beautiful things. And I hope you get the book because it'll explain. There's a whole lot to my life. So it was just a little bit today. Thank you.
Worthy of it.